What's happening, everybody? Welcome into your Friday edition of the Final Whistle Sports Podcast. And another day, another episode, another guest. Today, I have Gary Phillips. He writes for SI.com for the New York Yankees, as well as the Jets Wire, giving you a little bit of New York Jets coverage. If you really don't know anything about me, Gary was actually my former boss back in undergrad at the Suttonian newspaper, where he was the editor-in-chief, and I was one of his sports writers. Gary, how are we doing?
Doing good. It feels like that was way too long ago, a lot longer than it actually was.
No doubt. Are you ready to talk some sports?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, Gary, before we get started, I want you to give a little bit of your backstory, what drew you into sports journalism, what you've been working on. I know you've been doing some great pieces. You've actually had a couple pieces picked up by the New York Times recently. So why don't you just dive in a little bit about yourself? What drew you into sports journalism?
Well, I knew I wanted to be involved in sports, as early as high school. I knew that's where I wanted my career to be. Wasn't very good at math. Once we started getting away from like animals, nature, biology, I wasn't so good at science. So that kind of restricted me as far as what I could do in the sports world. Certainly wasn't going to play. I was always a pretty good writer in high school. I never minded like essay assignments or book reports or anything like that. And it just seemed like a logical conclusion to go into writing, go into media. And, I went into it in college thinking I just wanted to be in sports, and at Seton Hall doing the Suttonian, like you said, I really just fell in love with the reporting aspect of it, the storytelling aspect of it. So better or worse, that's what I've been doing ever since.
And then for you, for sports journalism, it's not the 9 to 5 type of job. It's us. We're sometimes up at 3 a.m. writing a story that we didn't think we would be breaking at 3 a.m. that night or that morning. For you, how do you try to balance your everyday life with that 24-hour schedule?
Well, lately I've been doing a lot of freelancing. So the one good thing about that is it's a lot of on my schedule at my own convenience, my own leisure. There's definitely an aspect of having to give yourself a little extra kick in the butt when it comes to being productive, finding a routine every day that works for you. I have designated times where I like to map out story ideas or jot down or brainstorm potential ideas. The writing I kind of just do whenever I'm feeling creative about it. That's one of the good things about not having too many hard deadlines with the places I'm writing for right now. But sometimes there is stuff that needs to get up in a timely manner or by a certain date, and that's usually when I find myself writing until 2 a.m. in the morning, or I start a piece thinking I'll just get a couple thoughts out or jot a couple lines down at 10 p.m. and next thing I know, it's past midnight. So I wouldn't say I have it fully under control when it comes to coming up with a day-to-day schedule.
I don't think any of us do. I work in the sports journalism business. It's a very hourly or even minute by minute schedule with the adjustments. And you've done some great pieces. Again, as I mentioned, you've been doing some stuff with the New York Times recently, getting picked up freelance there. You've also written for The Athletic. Is there like a story or an interview that really comes to mind for you that you're just like, wow, I can't believe I was able to write this?
For me, it was a piece I did for The Athletic a couple of years ago. It was about this former minor league pitcher, Dennis Baer, and he came up, with the Cubs right around the time Kerry Wood did, and they thought, these two guys were going to be the 1-2 punch in our rotation. They were going to be co-aces for years to come. Wood made it to the majors, was very good. Arm injuries obviously derailed his career, but Baer, he had several surgeries before he even reached the majors. Had to call it a career, but what he did was he used all his minor league connections and set up this charity that essentially partners with the Center for Missing Children, the National Center for Missing Children, and they put up these signs across minor league ballparks with the profiles of missing kids, what they look like, their pictures, where they were last seen, what they were wearing, and they have these signs all over minor league ballparks just trying to draw attention to these missing children cases. And that was just a really cool story that I got to do a couple of years ago that ultimately got that charity some attention and some sponsorship. And it was just, obviously a very good cause and, a very interesting story and career that he took.
Wow, that's awesome. That's a really unique, different perspective of how sometimes, especially in baseball, like those minor leaguers, it's very slim that they're able to get their way up into the major leagues, and how they end up taking different careers after baseball, even like for even any professional athlete, what they're doing post their athletic career. It's kind of unique to see how they try to envelop and develop new ideas that they want to bring into their fold of life, right?
Yeah, it was a really just great example of a guy not only pivoting and making something out of a terrible situation, with all the surgeries and injuries that he had, but also kind of using the connections he built up along the way through minor league baseball, through the different, teams that he played for in, these small towns and small cities across the country, and was just able to do something really good with it.
It's, for sure. That sounds absolutely incredible. Gary, I want to kind of switch gears here to now the present. Baseball's been going on for now a couple weeks. You're covering the Yankees for SI.com. I just want to get your overall take of how the baseball season has gone, and then give me a more of why are the Yankees off to such a slow start, in your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, hey, it's good to have baseball back. It's been an exciting start to the season. You got superstars all across the league playing at a really high level. There's been some good competition, some really good games in the early going, particularly on prime time. So can't ever complain when there's baseball on TV. As for the Yankees, I guess if you're a Yankees fan, you might have a few complaints. The pitching's taken a little bit of a nosedive the last couple games. The offense has yet to break out. A lot of double plays that they're hitting into. Not quite the power surge you would expect from a team like the Yankees. And then a lot of fundamentals stuff they're really struggling with. Defense, running, base running. So other than the bullpen, just about everything that could go wrong has so far. But I wouldn't be too worried about that so early in the season.
And I know Stanton and some of the other big names, other than Aaron Judge, who is off to one of the few hot starts for the Yankees. And then Corey Kluber has not really lived up to the hype so far as the #2 starter. What do you think it's the moment for them, especially in Kluber's case, finally being a part of the Yankees? Do you think that moment's kind of being overwhelmed for him, or what's your overall take?
Yeah, I actually had a piece that just went up today on Kluber and kind of the rough start that he's had, basically saying, it's a little too early to hit the panic button. Look, he might not be, he's definitely not Corey Kluber anymore. I don't think you're going to see him winning a Cy Young again or returning to his Cleveland form. But I also think after 3 starts, it's too early to start saying things like he's washed up or this was a bad signing. He's pitched 36.2 innings over the last 2 seasons, just 1 last year. He's always been a slow starter in April. And, not that he's pitched necessarily well, but he also hasn't had very good defense behind him in 2 out of 3 of his starts. So when you're coming back from injury, when you're on a strict pitch limit, that's every extra out you give away or pitch that you have to throw is gonna hurt you. So I would say give him a little more time before we start rushing to conclusions. This past start against the Blue Jays, you actually saw an uptick in velocity from him. That's a really encouraging sign. His cutter moved very well. Got a lot of swings and misses on that pitch. So let's give him a few more games to kind of come back from what was more or less a 2-year absence. Aside from a few innings here and there.
Very true, very true. And why is the Bronx Bombers offense really diminished so far this year? Do you think it's just the altitude, being on the road a little bit early to start? You're not playing at the Yankee Stadium. What's the deal there?
It's weird. You think of the Yankees as this home run hitting team, this, one of these big launch angle and, exit velocity teams. They're hitting the ball into the ground a lot. You're seeing that exasperated by kind of the double plays that they're leading the league in, but it's just a lot of hitting the ball into the ground rather than elevating it and driving it, which just, has kind of gone against everything they've been about the last few years.
Yeah, and I have the Yankees as my representative out of the American League. Am I jumping off the bandwagon way too early? What's the take there?
Nah, I would still say this is probably the best or, top 2 teams in the American League. I would expect them to be right up there at the top at the end of the year.
Okay, and the AL East has actually gotten off to a better start than I actually anticipated with Boston. The Red Sox off to a decent start. Baltimore, I think, is hovering around 500 right now. Toronto's got off to a decent start. Tampa Bay. Do you think the AL East is going to be the most competitive division?
I don't know about that. I actually think that's going to be the NL counterpart. But yeah, it's been a pretty competitive division so far early in the season. You know, you looked at that first opening series with Boston and Baltimore, with the Orioles going into Fenway Park and sweeping them. You kind of thought, okay, well, the Red Sox are going to roll over again this year, but they've stormed right back. And then Tampa's always going to be good, especially with the pitching. Toronto's got a really young team that made the push for the playoffs last year. They got a little better over the offseason. They got a little older, more experience. That's a team that I think is going to be a real nuisance, not just this year, but for a long time.
I agree. I think Toronto is a real dark horse out of the American League this year that they may just sneak in as a wild card, but I think they may scare a team in that opening round series if they get through that wild card game.
I tell you what, regardless of how good their record is at the end of their year, they're going to score a lot of runs. That's going to be a tough team to pitch against all season.
For sure. And you kind of mentioned that the NL East was your top division right now, in your opinion. The Mets, they've kind of been hit by the COVID, maybe not by themselves, but everyone that they're playing seems like they get stuck on a COVID pause. Their game got, again, postponed today. They're going to try and play a doubleheader tomorrow. Do you think this is – I know it's going to be inevitable. There's going to be pauses, but it feels like the Mets have just gotten the bad luck of a draw to start this year. Do you think this could wane on them down the road?
I mean, hey, you got COVID, you got blizzards. I mean, the Mets can catch a break, and for once, it's not necessarily their fault. But at some point, whether it's the middle of the year, the next couple of weeks, end of the year, at some point they're going to have a lot of games to make up in a short stretch. It's going to cost them off days. It's going to cost them in their pitching, particularly their bullpen. So we'll see how they kind of prepare for that or respond to it in the aftermath, depending on when all these games are getting officially made up. They have tentative dates, but as we've seen, anything can happen. So let's not act like the schedule is guaranteed or a lock. It'll be interesting to see what kind of moves they make, particularly around the trade deadline, determining whether or not they need to stock up on bullpen arms or guys who maybe aren't solidified relievers, but guys who have major league experience, because they're going to need some extra arms at some point.
Yeah, and you'll see a lot more spot starters probably from them, from that bullpen. You'll see a couple more bullpen games where you get you get a long reliever to go 3 or 4 innings, then your bullpen gets waned.
Right, and right now it's the Mets, but odds are it's going to happen to somebody else. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. It's still an issue. So I think pitching in particular is going to be something a lot of teams have to be creative about this year.
Yeah, and because COVID has already ramped up MLB a little bit earlier on the year, do you think the goal is still to get all 162 in, or would you think that it's going to be down to winning percentage again, and then hopefully everyone gets around 140, 150 games?
I mean, I think 162 is definitely the goal. How realistic that is for every single team, we can only wait and see.
Very true. So, Gary, for you, I want to ask you before we switch gears to football here in the Jets, what for you is what's your World Series look like? What's your ALCS and your NLCS? Give me a couple of predictions.
Ooh, wow. I don't usually do predictions. I haven't thought that far ahead. I'll tell you what, I'll tell you in the NL, the World Series representative is going to come out of the NL West.
Okay. Dodgers or Padres.
Yep. That's my bold prediction there. And then if I absolutely had to pick a team from the AL right now, I would probably go with the Yankees. But as we've seen, they're not off to such a hot start. I'm banking on them kind of turning things around and being a little better than they've shown themselves to be so far, but we'll see. Yeah,
for me too, because my prediction was Dodgers back-to-back, and they're going to beat the Yankees this year. So now I feel all right. Now that I have someone in agreement with me,
not a terrible prediction. I will say I'd much prefer to see the Padres make it than the Dodgers there again. But
100%. But I mean, the Dodgers, I don't think there's not a team that hasn't been this stacked in baseball in a
Right.
long
I put
time.
it this way. I'd be betting on the Dodgers about that team.
I'll put my money on it. Maybe not my house down, but I'll put money on it. Let's jump to the Jets now. You work for the Jets Wire as well, writing for them. The Jets now have the number 2 and the number 23 pick in the first round. Where should the Jets go? What are your overlying assumptions? I know Darnold's gone, so we're almost assuming that quarterback will be done with the number 2 pick. Do you think it's inevitable lock that it's Zach Wilson right now?
I mean, that certainly seems to be the case. Every report that's been out, and even comments from Joe Douglas have indicated that it's going to be Zach Wilson. There was, Steve Young, great NFL quarterback, but also pretty plugged into BYU. He said a few weeks ago that the Jets basically committed to Wilson and Wilson's family. When Joe Douglas was asked about that, he didn't necessarily dispute it. So, he said, Steve Young's pretty plugged in over there. He knows what he's talking about. So I would be shocked at this point if Zach Wilson is not going to be a New York Jet.
For you personally, would you take Wilson at 2 there, or would you go a different route?
Look, I've never been, a guy who's super plugged into college football and watching all the film and all the tape. I'm not an expert on the quarterback class or the prospect class. Don't want to come off as one, but I think you can't really go wrong with Wilson or Fields at this point.
Okay, because personally, I have Fields as my number 2 quarterback on my board, so I'd be leaning Justin Fields just because for me, Zach Wilson has all the talent in the world. I think you can't go wrong either way. I think the injury, past history in college at BYU, he's had a shoulder injury as well as a leg injury as well in college. It may not have subsided him for many games, but like that shoulder injury that he had a couple of years ago, that took him out 4 or 5 games. I think that just really, for me, gives me some red flags, like how the whole Tua situation was handled at Alabama. Why I preferred Herbert over Tua last year because of, again, the intangibles of health.
Right. There's that. There's also, the concern that he didn't really play any great competition while at BYU. For me, I think it comes down to more than just who the best raw talent is. I think the Jets really look at Wilson as a great fit in Mike LaFleur's offense, which is going to look a lot like Kyle Shanahan's in San Francisco. It's predicated on play action and mobility, on accurate passes, all things that Wilson were able to do pretty well at BYU. And then you got to go back and look at the last guy, Sam Darnold, everybody said, was among the most talented quarterbacks in his class. He was right up there with Baker. That was the projection. He wasn't in a good fit. He was in a terrible offense. He didn't have any supporting cast. He didn't have any competent coaching around him. It's more important than who the Jets take with this pick is the personnel that's going to be around the quarterback. Fortunately for the Jets, they look like they're in a much better position now than they were at the start of the Darnold years. So you're just looking for fit more than anything else. And I think Wilson, they've pegged as that guy.
I agree. I think a lot of it's come down to fit. Robert Saleh, the head coach, he will instill a team that will rally around his quarterback. Especially that's what he did at San Francisco. He was a great motivator and he's a great defensive mind, but he understands the nuances of the quarterback position better than I think people realize, which will definitely help Wilson in that situation. But for you, I know Darnold was traded to Carolina. Do you think he can resurrect it there?
I guess it depends on how you define resurrect. Look, as I just said, he didn't have a good supporting cast. He didn't have good coaching in New York. They made his life as hard as they possibly could with the Jets. I don't want there to be any confusion about that. With that said, there were plenty of instances where Darnold didn't do himself any favors either. So I don't see him becoming an all-pro quarterback or, even necessarily a reliable one, but I do think he will be a lot better in Carolina. Obviously, that's going up against a very low bar, but he's got actual weapons around him. He'll have a better offensive line. He'll have, much better offensive minded coaches, guys, not just offensive minded, but, innovative offensive minds there in Joe Brady and Matt Rule. So I can't imagine him being worse there. I just don't know how high his ceiling is, because it was just so hard to evaluate him these last 3 years.
I agree, because of just how, no, I'm going to put it bluntly, how bad the Jets organization was set up. And just based off of the personnel that was brought in, I didn't think Adam Gase didn't even deserve the job in the first place. I don't know if you want to give a take on that with the whole Adam Gase hiring.
No, I mean, you nailed it. I mean, it was crazy that he got a job after, not only the results, but the way in which he went about them in Miami. And they got exactly what they asked for.
For sure. And now let's move up. I don't think people realize the Jets have another pick after the second pick in the first round.
They got a lot of picks.
They got a lot of picks. And so what would you do next? What would be the next move? Would it be offensive line, go defense? What do you think they should go?
Obviously, it depends on who's still on the board, but with that, that 23 pick, you've seen some talk about, like, maybe them going after one of the top running backs. That's a luxury that they can't afford. That's not something that they can do. If I'm Joe Douglas, I'm going best player available between cornerback and offensive line. They didn't sign anybody as far as cornerbacks go in free agency. They really didn't make any moves on the offensive line other than backups, despite being terrible at those two positions this past season. I mean, those are their biggest needs. That's where you need a guy who can be a starter from day one. So those are the two positions Douglas needs to focus on there. You find a running back or, more pass catcher as a tight end. You find those guys later in the draft.
I agree 100%. And I think this is one of the best cornerback classes that this year has offered in a long time. You have 5 cornerbacks that are probably going to be first round draft picks. I think 3 of them might be gone by the Jets get that second pick, but I think 2 of them should be there, either in, and not in this order, maybe Caleb Farley or Greg Newsome from Northwestern, or as well as Asante Samuel Jr. out of Florida State. I think you have a real opportunity to go there. And I think people misunderstand how this running back class has a couple steals that you can get in the second or third round. Like, right. Either guy from North Carolina is a top running back, and they shared the load last year, and they both carried for 1,000 yards. So
right, and even forgetting just the names available, like, you got to keep in mind, again, going back to LaFleur's offense, Shanahan's offense in San Francisco, that they essentially use a running back by committee approach. You're not using a first round pick, even if it's your second first round pick on a running back. There's just no need to, not only in today's NFL, but specifically in the offense the Jets are going to run. It just wouldn't be a wise selection, no matter how talented the player is.
For sure. So for the Jets, what would you define as a successful season going into this year? What is success in your opinion? I know it's a very general word. Do you think just beating last year's win total, being competitive? What are the signs for you?
I mean, competitive is obviously the first thing you want to see. That's an old line for Jets fans. I know Jets fans are sick and tired of hearing that. But you got a new head coach, you got a rookie head coach, you're going to have a rookie quarterback, you're going to have an overall very young roster. You're just looking for them to be better, and sometimes that might not show up in the wins and loss columns. I think ideally it'd be crazy to expect anything better than a 7-9 or 8-8 season. I just don't see how that's going to unfold. They've got a tough schedule, and you've just got so many new pieces, so many inexperienced pieces. It's an exciting time, I think, if you're a Jets fan, but at the same time, you have to temper those expectations. This team's not turning things around and contending for a Super Bowl this year.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that the AFC East is probably going to be one of the toughest divisions. Are going to try and get 3 teams out of the division to make the playoffs, with New England, Miami, and Buffalo. I don't think that helps them that much either. So,
and I think, obviously you got to see what happens in the draft, but no matter what, this is still going to be a team that has holes, after the draft, and maybe those holes will be plugged. Some of them will be plugged, like we said, cornerback, offensive line, but they're going to be plugged by young players. They're going to be plugged by inexperienced guys who are still getting their feet wet and are going to have growing pains, and that includes Zach Wilson or Justin Fields, whoever the quarterback ends up being. Robert Saleh is going to have growing pains. Mike LaFleur is going to have growing pains. So let's not get too ahead of ourselves.
Yeah. And before we wrap up, Gary, I want to go through a couple fan questions that were asked. So my first one that I have from a fan is, what do you say to an aspiring sports journalist? What is the most important advice that you would give them, or just a general idea?
Run the other way. No, I'm just kidding. This is an awesome job. It's an awesome way to make a living. The one thing I would just say is, if you're in college, or if, you're fortunate enough that your high school has a paper, mine didn't, take that stuff seriously. Take student media seriously, whether it's your newspaper or, we had Pirate TV, we had WSOU, the radio station. Take that stuff seriously. It's not a hobby. It's not an after school activity. And honestly, it's not even just something you're doing as a student. It's real world work experience that's going to set you up if you take it seriously. And in the same kind of thought there, treat wherever you are, whether it's your school or your town, whatever it is that you're covering, treat it as a community. You're reporting on your community. You're reporting on, those around you, their stories around you. Be an expert on whatever is going on your campus, your town, your city, wherever it is you are. If you take advantage of that, you're going to really grow as a reporter. It's going to be a lot easier for you to do the work and enjoy the work and find it rewarding. So that would be my advice.
I love it. I think I completely agree. For me, it's always embrace the grind. Embrace it. It's not going to be that typical, as we mentioned, that 9-to-5 job. You might be up at different hours of the day. Your hours might be a little bit different. Could be 1 minute you're doing something, next minute you're doing something else. Just embrace the grind and take advantage of every opportunity. Like you just said, like WSOU, like for us, or Pirate TV or Setonian, those were reps that we were able to use.
Yep.
That even if it didn't go perfectly with a story or with how we broadcasted, it turns into a learning experience that, hey, I can turn this into something that I can improve on, that I want to put in my resume, my reel, or etc. Just something that you can have as some groundwork for a portfolio too. So
yeah, when I was covering the Seton Hall basketball team for the Setonian, I always looked at it as I was doing professional work, and I was, competing with professionals at the New York Post, NJ.com, Asbury Park Press. And, in return, by taking up that attitude and, putting in the work that goes with that, I kind of felt always that I had the same view reciprocated from those guys on that beat. When I was editor-in-chief of the paper, I looked at the Seton Hall campus as a community and, a group of people to be covered seriously. And that was how we went about our business. So that's my advice.
Absolutely. Next question was, what is if you're doing an interview or a recap, or if you're talking to somebody, what is your go-to question that you usually ask 9 times out of 10?
See, I don't really have a go-to. Like I'm always one of the guys who doesn't like to get too many unnecessary questions into a post-game interview or, like a press conference setting. I'd rather wait until everybody's in the pre-COVID days when you had locker room access and you could talk to a guy face to face. I was always somebody that would try to get, something out of the ordinary in with a player after the scrum has kind of moved away. I always figured the questions that are being asked in the press conferences, those are more for the beat reporters, which I haven't traditionally been, since I was back at Seton Hall covering the basketball team. I've done a lot more feature work or analytical work, stuff that's a little outside of the box. So questions I always want to ask aren't necessarily ones I want to ask in front of other people and give other ideas away.
Yeah. So what's that outside of the box mentality that you try to utilize? Are you just trying to think of something that I've read something about this? You're trying to ask them that, or are you trying to think of something creative, create a different angle that someone may not even be thinking about?
Yeah, inspiration for ideas comes from all over the place. Sometimes it'll be watching a broadcast, or I'll read one line or one sentence in somebody's work on an entirely different topic, and it's like, well, why didn't we expand on that? Or I could dive deeper into that. So I'm just looking for stuff that's outside the box. I love stories that show how sports and athletes kind of intersect with the rest of the world, whether it's politics, race, society, culture, all that stuff. I love showing how that stuff kind of all merges together and doing stories about that. I like stories that are just quirky and weird, that only my scattered brain would think of. So it comes from everywhere. I've got a long list of ideas that I may never even get to or complete, but just looking for stuff that's original, looking for stuff that other people aren't doing, or even if it is a story or a topic that other people are covering, well, how can I come about this differently? So that's all I'm ever trying to do, is just take a unique perspective on things.
Yeah. And then the last question is, where do you see what's your overall goal in sports journalism? Where do you want to be down the road, hopefully, for yourself?
Well, I'd like to be a features editor, a features writer or editor, down the road. How many of those jobs are going to exist as time keeps passing by? I'm not entirely sure. But right now that's a lot of the work that I'm doing, in a freelance capacity. And just keep grinding away, like you said before. You just got to keep grinding.
Absolutely. Gary, I want to thank you for your time today. It was an absolute pleasure to catch up with you. I know it's been way too long. And just let everyone know, where can they catch your stuff at, and to follow you on your social media platforms. Let them know where you're at.
Yeah, so everything I write, whether it's for Sports Illustrated Yankees or Jets Wire, or stuff I'm doing for the Times or Baseball Prospectus, so on and so forth, you can find everything on my Twitter handle at Gary H. Phillips. I'm always sharing my stuff there and self-promoting and making sure those articles get out.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, go follow Gary. Go check out his work. He's doing some great stuff right now. Again, for the Yankees, the Jets, as well as even had some stuff picked up recently by the New York Times. And that's just wild to think about that. I am even talking to someone that's had some work by the New York Times, and he's someone that I've actually known quite well for a long time. So, Gary, thank you so much. Thanks for joining. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me on, man. This was great. Love talking about journalism and sports anytime.
Absolutely, man. Hopefully we'll do this again soon. Everyone, that was your Friday edition of the Final Whistle Sports Podcast. We got some great content coming out next week as well. Be on the lookout. We got interviews and more.